Good morning. This is Henry once again, and I want to continue our study in the book of Revelation. This time, I want to put chapters 2 and 3 as a form of introduction because this is probably one of the most important parts of the book. It tells us something about these churches. In chapter 1, we talked about who they were, where they're located, what John's relationship to them was, and we're told about a vision John saw. And so as we begin our study on the seven churches, I'd like to begin in verse 19 of chapter 1, where it says, "Write the things that you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will be hereafter." And this morning, as I was thinking about those verses, it took on a new spin with me. I told you that in time past, somebody liked to use this as an outline for studying the book of Revelation, and it can be used that way. But as I thought about the meaning of the words in relationship to the message to the seven churches, I began to see something different. And I'm wondering if this isn't the proper way to understand these words. For instance, as we look at these seven churches, we notice that each of them have different characteristics attached to them. They have certain problems that are addressed, and there were seven in number, and they relate to these particular churches. And as we begin each section, part of the vision that we have seen previously in chapter 1, the hair like wool and the eyes like a flame of fire, and out of his mouth went a two-edged sword, and he walks in the midst of the golden candlesticks. All of these has some reference to the beginning of each of these chapters, each of these churches. So when we think about the things that you have seen, I think it can be more clearly understood by saying that these particular things you have seen have some reference to the address to each of these churches. So I tend to think now, after thinking about it and how it relates to what is about to happen, I think that application is more correct, or that interpretation, I say, that it refers basically to the things in the church in which he has seen concerning them, the things that are the present problem. And then later on, at the end of each one of these messages to the churches, there is a promise and an application given of what will happen if they conform to what instruction has been given to them to clear up the problems. So it's interesting that those three words, the things which are, refer to the beginning, the things that are, the present circumstance, and finally, the things that shall be hereafter, talks about what will happen once they comply to the closing message. Now, that's probably a little different than you've heard it before, but I think it makes sense. And as we start reading through the churches and looking at the churches, it's good to have this kind of background and thought applied to that. Now, how do we approach these churches? There's seven churches with seven different problems. It's interesting. Of those seven churches that are addressed, two of them have no problems at all. And it's interesting, both of them are faithful, but God has a different promise to the church of Smyrna than he does to the church at Philadelphia. To the church at Smyrna, it's a message of suffering that they must face. And then to the church at Philadelphia, it's a message of successes that they will achieve. So it's interesting. Even faithful churches come into different categories, and the promises attached to being faithful are not always the same for one church it is to another. So it's just a few incidents here. Now, I would like to share an outline that applies to all 7 of these churches. Several years ago, I was listening to a series of messages by Roy Hession on the book of Job, and I thought it was extremely interesting the way he outlined the book. He talked about the first part, the first couple chapters being the prologue, and then he talked about from chapters 3 all the way to chapter 35 or 38 as the dialogue. And then finally, the closing chapters where Job comes to grips with God and his own particular problem is the epilogue. I thought it was a nice way to outline the book, and I can do the same thing here with the 7 churches. First, we have the prologue, where God addresses the churches. He addresses the 7 churches. And then he talks about the positive and the negative qualities in the church and the problems that need to be addressed. And then he gives at the end a prologue. What am I going to do about it? What do I do now? Now that I know what the problem is and what the solution is, what do I do about that? And that talks about the hereafter. Now, it's a little different approach than what you usually hear, but I think in reference to the study of the 7 churches, we'll use this approach. Now, there are some things that all of these churches have in common. For instance, each one of them is addressed as having an angel assigned to them. Then also, of course, there is an aspect of Jesus Christ given to each one of these churches. To one, it's he that walks among the golden candlesticks. Another one is he with the sharp two-edged sword. And he talks about the other aspects of it, which we'll get to when we look at each one of these. But they have some reference to the addresses as Jesus talks about their problem. Also, he has something in between the address. He talks about their situation, good and bad and positive and negative, and what needs to be corrected. And then finally, at the end, he gives them a promise, if they are faithful, what they can expect to happen. So all of these have that in common as to the 7 churches. Now, let me just say, these are not 7 periods of church history. I think it's important, or they are not references to a church age. And the reason I say that is because these churches would have no idea what those church ages were like, because they all happened after God gave the address to the church. God is addressing to the church, particularly to some particular thing that is peculiar to them. He's not talking about a church age, and he's not saying after this, at the end of Laodicea, that now the church is raptured and we go up to chapter 4 and see what it's like in heaven. I made the mistake in my first attempt to write Revelation to look at the church chapters 4 and 5 as what is heaven really like. Now, although that may be partially true, that is not the purpose of that chapter. And so after I read from somebody who knew what they were talking about, I found out that was a wrong application. So I had to change my book, of course, and try another edition. And when I got to chapter 12, I talked about that as being a message from history. And although there may be some reference to history there, that's not the theme of the chapter. And as we expound Revelation, we're going to see how all of these things fit together more perfectly. So just explaining to you the mistakes I made when I first attempted to write a book on Revelation. But one of the things that caught my attention when I first started reading, especially the church of Ephesus, I began thinking about, now, what is this church like? What is God saying about that? It has a lot of good things he said about them, and they said some bad things about them. And as I thought about the good things, I thought about how many churches I've been to that were like this. They had this quality. They were strong in faith. They were careful to make sure they didn't allow false doctrine in the church. And I said, this is the kind of church I want to be a part of. They were very orthodox. I come from an Episcopalian background, so I like that kind of formal stuff. And I said, well, and then I thought about the problem. I said, I know of churches like this too that weren't formal, that they had the same kind of problem. So as I thought about Ephesus and the problems that are going through Ephesus, I said, I noticed immediately a problem I called a problem of orthodoxy. In other words, you could become so orthodox and rigid in your orthodoxy that you could miss something important. And this is what they did. And when Jesus said they left their first love, it means that something important that they once held tightly to has been replaced by something else. So I saw the church at Ephesus being the Orthodox church. So then I went to the church of Smyrna. It was a little different. They were facing persecution, and they were being truthful and honest, and they were not allowed to do certain things because of their faith. And Jesus told them, "Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life." In other words, God is telling them, do not fear the persecution that shall come upon you. It's all part of the program. It's all part of being a Christian. It comes along with being faithful. So I say that was the persecuted church. Then I got to the church at Pergamos. Well, they had a couple problems there. It seemed like they were getting a little bit too loose in their theology. I said, well, if I had a choice between Ephesus and Pergamos, I think I'd rather be in Ephesus. But Pergamos was a different problem. They allowed a lot of corrupting influences in the church, and the church became quite liberal and not have any standards at all. So the church of Pergamos, I say, is the corrupted church. Then I got to the church of Thyatira. What is the problem there? Well, they have allowed something to come into that church, a teaching, and they referred it to Jezebel. If you know anything about Jezebel, she was a cruel person. She was wicked, and she was very forceful, and nobody dared stand up against her. And what had happened was this church had allowed this kind of influence to come into the church, and they didn't want to do anything about it. And I called it the compromising church. They allowed the problem to remain, and they were afraid to stand up against it, and probably they were in the minority. But we'll talk about that problem more particularly when we get to it. And then we come to the church of Sardis. That's the dead church. Oh, has lots of activity, but nothing spiritual is going on. I think a lot of people attended that church because it was a very entertaining program, but it was dead. I remember Tozer in one of his books, he says something about in some churches, if the Holy Spirit was missing, no one would ever know the difference. And that's the church of Sardis. They were dead, totally dead. They had a lot of activity, but there was no life, no official. Like, oh yes, there was life. They were lively. They were entertaining. They met all the needs of the people that they wanted to have met. But when it came to spiritual activity and truth, they were dead. That was it. God saw them as dead. They were a dead church. And when we get to the book of Sardis, the church of Sardis, we'll get to see more specifically what that means. Then there was the church at Philadelphia. Wow, that's the kind of church you want to be part of. And, You know, friends, it's hard to find a church like Philadelphia. It was a church that because they were faithful, God protected, said that they would be victorious over their enemies, and even their enemies would join them and be part of their group, and they even fall at their feet and worship them in the sense that they would be submissive rather than be antagonistic to them. They would have total victory over enemies. Now they were faithful, but that was a different problem than the problem given at Smyrna, where they were promised that they had to endure suffering and what would happen when they did so. So the church of Ephesus, the church of Smyrna, and the church of Philadelphia, both churches that were faithful to Jesus Christ, but the outcome of their faithfulness was different. And then finally, we have the church at Laodicea. I had a hard time trying to put a name on this. It says they were either they were lukewarm. They weren't either cold or hard. They were kind of in the middle. So I call them the indifferent church. And I'm not so sure that's the best title for them. Maybe as we study, might come up with a better one. But I think the idea was that they were people because they had riches and they were proud, and maybe they were just a proud and a self-satisfied church. Perhaps maybe that's a different way. But I thought about Elijah. Remember he said, "How long halt ye between two opinions? And make it, if God be God, worship him. If Baal be Baal, worship him." But get out from being in the middle and make a choice. And so God is talking about the church at Laodicea being, I call it the indifferent church. But like I say, as we study it a little further, I may change my mind on that. That's nothing wrong with that. I might a little bit more insights and a better title for that church. But here are 7 churches that have certain characteristics that will be present in the church prior to the coming of the Lord. And friends, we don't have to wait until the coming of the Lord to see them. Because if you look at the churches around you and you look carefully, understand these principles found in these 7 churches, it's not hard to see these same churches available in our own time today, operating on the same principles. It's hard today to find a church like Smyrna, unless you go to a place like Sudan or some places in Africa where extreme persecution has taken place. I had a man from the Sudan who worked with me who escaped that. He says he and his wife had to survive by eating grass. So we never know some of these, and he was a Christian man. And so we never know some of the things that happened during the time of extreme persecution. So we find that they're both different. You find churches like Smyrna, but they're faithful. And then churches like Philadelphia. Where do you find a church like Philadelphia today? You can find the other ones around quite easily, but it's kind of hard to find one like Philadelphia. But I think Philadelphia represents the church within the church. Let's put it that way. It's the church operating under the principles of God, and they may not be part of the main line. They may be the minority. They may be. We're told in the Old Testament about a remnant among the Israelites, that a small number of Israelites will be faithful in those last days. And I'm not uncertain that may refer to the church of Philadelphia. They are faithful, but they are minority. They mean the ones that people overlook and pay no attention to, but they're the ones that God's working in. And so as we come to these churches, we'll come to see how they apply to the church today in preparation for the coming of the Lord. So I send that to you because I don't know how many people in their books on Revelation deal with these churches this way. But I thought it was a good practical way to introduce these 7 churches. So for the next few weeks, I might spend 7 weeks talking about each one of them, or I might consolidate it. I'll do the best I can to explain each of these churches and help you to understand the how God sees them at the beginning, what their problem is, the strengths and weaknesses, and solution God gives, and the promise He gives when they are faithful to listen to what He said. The what shall be hereafter is what will take place when they obey the Lord and they receive the promise He gives. Now, that also says that after the churches, there's going to be a message from chapters 4 to 18 that deals with what will happen thereafter. But we find, first of all, chapter 1 was basically the address to the churches, and then chapter 2 and 3 describe the churches themselves, and then finally verses 4 through 18 tell us the times of preparation in the church for the arrival of the bridegroom. In chapter 19, we're told when the bridegroom comes, it says, the bride has now made herself ready. I wrote a book on the churches, and I called it Unprepared for the Wedding. And you may think that's a strange title to give to those churches, but if you take the view of the church being caught up in a rapture and they won't have to go through any persecution, then you might not like that title. But I didn't use that approach. I think the churches, as we see them, are yet unprepared for the Lord's return, and time is needed for them to work on the problems that are addressed. And we find verses 4 through 18, events taking place during the time of their being prepared. And chapter 19, the good news is they have arrived at the point where they are now ready for the arrival of the bridegroom. So that gives a little bird's eye view of chapters 2 and 3. I hope they have been helpful. Thank you for being part of us today, and I hope that maybe this makes things a little clearer as to where we're going as we continue our study.